July 11, 1943. The road to Palermo, Sicily. George Patton's 7th Army is moving at a speed that the German commanders defending the island have never seen from an Allied force. And somewhere in North Africa, Rommel is reading the report of what Patton is doing and recognizing something of himself. The Sicilian campaign is 17 days old. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily that began on July 10th, with the largest combined amphibious operation of the war to that point, has been consuming both armies in the bitter, close-quarters fighting of Sicily's mountain interior, where the terrain gives every advantage to the German and Italian defenders, and where the Allied advance that the plan projected would be measured in days has instead been measured in brutal attritional engagements for individual hills and road junctions that the maps identify by numbers rather than names. General Harold Alexander's 15th Army Group has been advancing on two parallel axes. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's British 8th Army on the east, driving north from the landing beaches toward Messina, and General George Patton's American 7th Army on the west, assigned the secondary role of protecting Montgomery's flank, while the 8th Army makes the primary advance. Patton has been chafing against the secondary role assignment since before the operation began. He is 47 years old in July 1943, has been commanding at Army level for 3 months, and has spent his entire professional military career preparing for exactly the kind of mobile armored warfare that Sicily's western half, the open country beyond the mountains, the coastal roads that connect the western ports, offers, and that his current assignment does not permit him to conduct. On July 11th, Alexander's orders have not changed. On July 11th, Patton changes them himself, securing retroactive permission for an advance on Palermo that his operational planning has been preparing for days, committing his armor and his infantry to a drive across western Sicily at a pace and with an operational aggression that produces, in the German military's reports to Berlin and in the private communications of German commanders that the post-war record will eventually provide, the specific professional reaction that Patton's military career has always been designed to produce, the recognition that the officer executing this maneuver is operating at a level that most Allied commanders have not previously demonstrated. The Germans have a name for this recognition. They call it Fingerspitzengefühl, fingertip feel, the specific tactical intuition that identifies what the situation requires before the analysis of the situation has produced a formal conclusion, and that translates that intuition into action at a speed that the opponent's response cannot keep pace with. Rommel, who has fought in the same theater and whose name has become synonymous with exactly this quality of intuitive armored command, reads the reports of Patton's Sicily advance and identifies, in the speed and the operational logic of what Patton is doing, a commander who possesses the same quality in the same degree. The recognition produces an assessment that Rommel communicates in his private writings and in his correspondence with senior German officers with the directness of a professional who has encountered, in an adversary, something that he respects in the way that men who have spent their lives in a craft respect craftsmanship when they find it. Not the mechanical respect of an opponent, acknowledging that he has been bested, but the specific professional recognition that the man on the other side has understood something about the nature of the battle that only a certain kind of mind understands, and has translated that understanding into operational action at the speed and the scale that the understanding requires. This is a commander who thinks the way I think, who moves the way I move, and who is doing to Sicily what I would do to Sicily in his position. The assessment is not a single statement, but a pattern visible in the intelligence summaries that Rommel's staff prepares for him from the reports of German commanders in Sicily, in his private letters to his wife Lucy that describe the Allied military performance in terms that occasionally depart from the professional assessment register into something closer to genuine admiration, and in the post-battle analyses that Rommel produces throughout his command career, and that return, when Sicily is the subject, to the specific operational decisions of Patton's advance as the most instructive example available of how armored exploitation should be conducted when the operational conditions permit it. To understand what it means that Rommel identified Patton as the Allied commander whose thinking most closely paralleled his own, you have to understand what the two men shared before they ever operated in the same theater, before Sicily made the parallel visible in operational terms. They share something that is rarer than military genius and more practically significant than courage. They share a reading list and a tactical philosophy whose convergent development in officers whose careers had proceeded on opposite sides of the professional military education and experience divide, in armies whose institutional cultures and doctrinal traditions are significantly different, produced nearly identical conclusions about what modern mechanized warfare required of the commander who intended to win it, rather than merely contest it. This convergence is not coincidental. It is the product of a specific intellectual tradition in military thinking, the tradition of Napoleon's operational genius, as systematized by Clausewitz and Jomini, as practiced by the commanders of the American Civil War, that both Rommel and Patton studied intensively, as updated for the mechanized age by theorists like J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart, whose indirect approach concept Patton absorbed in American translation, and whose influence on German armored doctrine through Guderian and the Panzer theorists of the 1930s, Rommel's operational practice, reflects, without necessarily reflecting his direct reading. Two men studying the same body of historical evidence through different institutional and linguistic filters and arriving at the same conclusions about what decisive warfare requires. This is not a coincidence. It is the evidence that the conclusions are correct. Rommel had written Infantry Attacks in 1937, a study of his First World War tactical experience that articulated the principles of forward command, exploitation of initiative, and the aggressive pursuit of penetration beyond the defender's ability to respond that would define his Second World War operational style. Patton had been studying and writing about cavalry and armored warfare for decades before 1937. His 1927 translation and adaptation of a French cavalry manual, his lecture series at the Cavalry School at Fort Riley, his writing in the Cavalry Journal through the 1920s and 1930s, and had been articulating principles that parallel Rommel's with a consistency that suggests the two men, reading different source material in different languages on different sides of the Atlantic, had arrived at the same understanding of what the modern battle required. They both believed in command from the front, in the decisive importance of speed over firepower, in creating the disorientation that turns tactical success into operational victory, in the moral component of command, the specific effect on an enemy force of an opponent who moves faster than the enemy's decision cycle can keep pace with, who appears at positions the enemy believed were secure, who attacks from directions the enemy's defensive preparation did not anticipate, because the defensive preparation was built on the assumption that the attacker would advance at the pace that supply line doctrine and combined arms coordination prescribe, and in the willingness to accept the risk of an exposed flank, an uncertain supply line, a position that conventional military analysis would rate as requiring consolidation before any further advance, in exchange for the operational momentum that allows a force to reach its objective before the enemy can organize a coherent response. These are not tactical beliefs in the sense that individual tactical decisions reflect them. They are not the preference for a particular formation in the attack, or the prescribed response to a particular defensive arrangement, or the systematic bias toward a particular arm of the combined arms system. They are operational convictions that shape every decision, from the selection of the objective to the pace of the advance, to the management of the command climate, that produces from subordinate commanders the same initiative and the same operational aggression that the commanding general embodies, and that his physical presence at the front, his visible willingness to share the risk of the decisions he is making, his personal command energy that the soldiers who see him on the road transfer into an understanding that their own maximum effort is the appropriate response to the commander's visible maximum effort. All of that is part of the same conviction, expressed at every level, from the corps order to the company commander's decision to the private's willingness to keep moving when stopping is the more comfortable option. Rommel's Afrika Corps had been feared in North Africa not because its tanks were better than British tanks, though they were often better, but because Rommel drove the Afrika Korps at a pace and with a command energy that the British commanders facing him could not consistently match, and that their defensive planning could not consistently predict. Patton's Third Army in France in August 1944 would be feared not because its Sherman tanks were better than the Panthers opposing them, though the Shermans would be numerically vastly superior, but because Patton drove the Third Army at a pace and with a command energy that the German commanders facing him could not consistently match, and that their defensive planning could not consistently predict. The specific quality that produces this feared commander on both sides of the line is the same quality. The men who share it recognize each other. These beliefs were not widely shared in the military establishments of either Germany or America in the early years of the war. The German army had its share of Rommel skeptics in the officer corps, who found his forward command style reckless and his supply line management insufficient. And the American army had its share of Patton critics who found his personality difficult and his methods harsh. And both the German and American establishments had large institutional constituencies for the measured, coordinated, firepower-first approach to combat that the dominant doctrinal tradition in both armies prescribed as the correct alternative to the operational swashbuckling that Rommel and Patton practiced. They were the beliefs of men who had studied the history of decisive warfare, the campaigns of Caesar and of Frederick, of Napoleon, and of the Civil War generals, who had known when to press an advantage past the point that supply line arithmetic permitted, and had drawn from it conclusions that their institutional environments had not yet fully validated, and that the operational record of the war was, theater by theater and campaign by campaign, confirming at a cost in lives that the history of decisive warfare had always demanded from the men who pay for the victories the decisive commanders achieve. The professional trajectory that made Patton the Allied commander Rommel most recognized as a peer, the specific career arc whose output is visible in the Sicily advance, visible in the German intelligence assessment, visible in the Fortitude deception's exploitation of German fear of Patton's operational intentions, extends through three distinct phases before Sicily gives the recognition its operational foundation. Understanding those phases is understanding how a mind that had been preparing for this moment for 3 decades arrives at the moment ready to perform at the level the moment requires, in the way that readiness of this kind produces performance, not by executing a plan that has been developed for the specific circumstances, but by applying a set of deeply internalized tactical principles to the specific circumstances with the flexibility that deep internalization allows, and that surface-level plan execution does not. The first is the interwar writing and thinking, the decades of articles, lectures, and professional correspondence, through which Patton developed the tactical philosophy that his Sicilian advance will implement. The second is the Morocco landings of November 1942, where Patton commands the Western Task Force in the amphibious assault on Casablanca, and demonstrates, in the planning and execution of a complex combined arms operation against an uncertain level of French resistance, the organizational capability that large-scale command requires, and that his interwar career, however productive in its intellectual development, had not previously tested at this level. The third is the transformation of Second Corps, following Kasserine, where Patton assumes command on March 6, 1943, and in 11 days produces a visible and measurable change in the American forces' tactical discipline, command climate, and operational performance that the subsequent Battle of El Guettar validates with the kind of operational evidence that tactical philosophy requires to become operational reality. The German intelligence community monitoring American forces through this period tracks the Second Corps transformation in its reports with a professional recognition that Patton has produced, in 11 days, the kind of command climate change that their own officer education system teaches requires months, and that the Wehrmacht's own experience of commanding formations, whose institutional culture requires revisions suggests, requires longer than months, in the absence of the specific command authority and personal energy that Patton is applying to Second Corps, at a speed and directness that, from the German observer's professional perspective, resembles nothing so much as a Prussian general's assumption of a command that has been underperforming. The recognition is noted. The assessment of Patton as the most capable American commander available is beginning to form in German intelligence circles before Sicily confirms it, and it is forming not from any single report, but from the pattern of reports. The pattern of a commander who makes decisions faster than his opponent can respond to them, who imposes on his forces the operational tempo that his tactical instinct identifies as decisive, and who produces from those forces the specific tactical performance that such a commander tends to produce, because the forces understand, from the evidence of their own experience, that the decisions they are being asked to execute are the decisions of a man who knows what he is doing. July 17, 1943. 6 days after Patton's unauthorized advance toward Palermo begins. The 2nd Armored Division under Major General Hugh Gaffey is driving northwest on roads that the Sicilian summer has baked to the consistency of gravel, through dust that coats everything and everyone with a fine white powder that the men will describe for the rest of their lives as the specific texture of Sicily in July. The way the dust gets into the weapon mechanisms and requires cleaning every hour, the way it clogs the air filters of the tank engines and forces the maintenance crews to work on moving vehicles rather than wait for the column to halt, the way it makes the faces of the men in the open vehicles indistinguishable from each other within 30 minutes of the advance beginning. Everyone the same bone-white color under the Sicilian sun. The heat reaches 45 degrees Celsius on the exposed mountain roads, and that kills men who stop moving as efficiently as anything the enemy is doing. Heat casualties in the 2nd Armored through the Sicily advance run into the hundreds. Men who collapse from heat exhaustion in the shade of their vehicles and are given water and shade and told to find the column when they can walk again because the column is not stopping. Patton is not behind the advance. He is in it, forward, in a jeep, on the roads where the advance is happening, gathering information through direct observation of the tactical situation that his command vehicle's radio would provide more slowly and less accurately, because the reports moving through radio channels are always one conversation behind the reality on the road, and because the reality on the road is what Patton needs to see in order to make the decisions that the next hour of the advance will require. This is not theater, though Patton understands theater and uses it deliberately. It is the operational expression of the same tactical conviction that he shares with Rommel, that the commander who is physically present at the decisive point, who can see what the situation actually is, rather than receiving a summary of what observers believe it was an hour ago, makes better decisions than the commander who manages from the rear, and makes them faster, and makes them in a way that communicates to the men around him that the risk they are being asked to take is a risk that their commander is personally prepared to share. The men of the 2nd Armored and the 3rd Infantry and the 45th Infantry know that Patton is somewhere on the road ahead of them. Sometimes he is literally ahead of them. His jeep stopped on a hilltop, Patton standing in it with binoculars, looking at the next ridgeline, calculating what the next hour of the advance should be. When the lead elements of the 2nd Armored enter Palermo on July 22nd, Patton is not far behind. He is close enough to be there before the official entry, and he is there because being there is what the moment requires, not because the moment requires his presence to be symbolically photographed. The 3rd Infantry Division under Major General Lucian Truscott is advancing along the coastal road. The 45th Infantry Division under Major General Troy Middleton holds the flank against the German defenders in the mountains, who are attempting to disrupt the advance by attacking its exposed right side. In Palermo's outskirts on July 22nd, the 2nd Armored's lead elements enter the city 12 days after the Sicily operation began, capturing the Sicilian capital at a pace that shocks even Patton's own staff, which has planned the Palermo advance and has been projecting its timeline in terms of days per milestone, and that produces in Montgomery's 8th Army headquarters, receiving the reports of the American advance's speed, a response that the subsequent history of the British-American command relationship will reflect, a response of grudging professional recognition that the American force has done something that the 8th Army's own rate of advance has not matched and will not match in the campaign's equivalent period. The German commanders who report the fall of Palermo to Berlin describe the pace of Patton's advance with the specific language of professional military surprise. The American armor has moved faster than the terrain analysis projected, as achievable, has maintained operational coherence at rates of advance that German armored doctrine did not project as sustainable for a force operating at this distance from its supply base, and has demonstrated a command flexibility at the division and corps level that has prevented the German defenders from establishing the defensive positions that the terrain between the landing beaches and Palermo would normally have permitted. The near failure in the Sicily campaign, the operational development that comes closest to interrupting the Patton advance and to providing a different answer to the question of whether the German recognition of Patton's tactical quality was justified, arrives not from the German defensive effort, but from the Allied command structure. Alexander, informed of Patton's advance toward Palermo before it has been formally authorized, informed partly through the specific operational intelligence that 15th Army Group headquarters is receiving from 7th Army, and partly through the reports of British liaison officers attached to American units who are watching the American armor move northwest with the professional alertness of men who understand what the movement implies about Patton's intentions. Issues on July 13th. An order that can be read, and that different historians have read differently, as restricting American forces to their flank protection role, and as leaving no operational space for the Palermo advance. Patton interprets the order differently, with the specific flexibility of a commander who is accustomed to finding the operational space that orders leave, rather than the operational space they close, who has spent his career identifying the difference between what an order says and what an order permits, and who has developed, from decades of working within military command structures whose constraints he found professionally limiting, a specific skill at finding the course of action that achieves the operational objective while remaining technically within the bounds of the authority he has been granted. The Palermo advance in Patton's reading is permitted because Alexander's order does not explicitly forbid it, and because the operational situation, the vulnerability of the German defensive position in western Sicily, the opportunity for a rapid exploitation that will not remain available once the Germans consolidate, requires it. The tension between Patton's operational initiative and Alexander's command authority is the tension that defines the Sicily campaign at the highest Allied command level. And it is a tension that produces, in the week between July 13th and July 22nd, a series of communications between 7th Army Headquarters and 15th Army Group Headquarters that the participants will describe in their post-war accounts, with varying emphasis on the same underlying dynamic. Patton is doing what he believes the operational situation requires. Alexander is managing a coalition command relationship in which the relative status of the British and American components has political as well as military dimensions, and the resolution of the tension, the retroactive authorization of the Palermo advance, the subsequent widening of 7th Army's operational mandate, is produced by the operational facts on the ground, rather than by the command decisions that precede them. By the time Alexander authorizes what Patton has already done, Palermo has already fallen. The German command has already received the report. The assessment of Patton as an Allied commander, whose operational thinking operates at a level that their own doctrine identifies as dangerous, has already been revised upward from the El Guettar evidence to the Sicily evidence, and the implications of that revision will shape the German defensive planning for the remainder of the war. By the time of Operation Overlord's planning in late 1943 and early 1944, the German military's assessment of Patton as the Allied commander whose operational style they find most professionally threatening has reached the level of institutional policy. German intelligence analysts, tracking the available information about Allied command assignments and attempting to predict the operational intentions that those assignments imply, place Patton at the center of their projections for the Allied main effort against the continent. The specific mechanism by which this assessment is exploited is Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception plan that creates a fictional 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, under Patton's nominal command, and uses the German military's documented and specific respect for Patton to convince the German High Command that the Normandy landing is a feint and that the main Allied effort, commanded by the general who has demonstrated the most dangerous operational style in the Allied order of battle, is yet to come, at a point that the German defensive analysis identifies as the Pas de Calais. The deception is elaborate. Fusag is populated with notional divisions whose existence is supported by the signals traffic that the German monitoring services expect to see from a real army group, by double agents whose reports to German intelligence confirm Fusag's order of battle and operational preparations, and by the deliberate management of Patton's public visibility in England, the speeches, the appearances, the very specific pattern of a general who is obviously in England and obviously preparing something large, that feeds the German assessment that Patton's force is the one being held back for the main effort. The deception's effectiveness depends entirely on the German military's prior assessment of Patton. A general whom the Germans did not fear would not anchor a deception of this kind. The Germans would not hold their reserves to meet a threat from a commander they did not rate as capable of the operational coup de main that Fortitude implies. The deception works because the German assessment is genuine. The German fixation on Patton, their unwillingness to fully commit their armored reserves against the Normandy beachhead in the critical days of June and July 1944, because they continue to expect Patton's force to strike at the Pas de Calais, is the most direct and most consequential operational use of a personal reputation in the entire war. Patton is not at Normandy on June 6th, though German intelligence believes he should be, and finds his absence from the Normandy order of battle confirmation that the main blow has not yet fallen. His army group does not exist. His command is a fiction staffed with notional divisions and served by a double-agent network and a signals intelligence effort that feeds the German monitoring system exactly the traffic that German analysts expect to see from a genuine force preparing a major operation. The radio calls of a headquarters staff managing the logistics of an army group, the vehicle movements of formations conducting pre-invasion exercises, the pattern of a commander preparing to do what that commander's reputation says he is capable of doing, and the German High Command, knowing that the Allied commander whose operational style is most dangerous, commands a force that has not yet struck, cannot bring itself to commit its armored reserves against what might be the feint, while the real blow from Patton's army group is still coming from the Pas de Calais. The deception works because the German military respects Patton, and the German military respects Patton because the Sicily campaign has given that respect an operational foundation that the deception planners can build on. The legacy of what Rommel recognized in Patton, and of what the broader German military command came to understand about Patton through the operational evidence of 1942 and 1943, is not primarily a legacy about the two individuals. It is a legacy about the specific nature of military competence at the highest level, and about the specific characteristics that make one commander recognizable to another across the boundary of alliance and opposition. Rommel and Patton never met. They never operated in the same theater simultaneously. The closest they came to a shared operational space was the brief period of North Africa in early 1943, when Rommel commanded Army Group Africa and Patton commanded II Corps. The period when Rommel, in his last weeks of North African command, before his health forced his evacuation to Germany, was planning the attack through the western dorsal that became the Kasserine offensive, and Patton was in the process of transforming Second Corps from the formation that had failed at Kasserine into the formation that would perform at El Guettar. They were separated by the geography of the Tunisian front and by timing. Rommel's evacuation in March 1943 preceded Patton's most significant North Africa engagement, and the direct tactical encounter that would have made the parallel between them most visible never occurred. What the record has instead is the parallel itself. Two men on opposite sides of a war, trained in different armies, educated in different traditions, producing in their operational decisions the evidence of a shared understanding of what the decisive battle requires, that is more revealing than any direct encounter would have been. The encounter between them, in the only form it actually occurred, was the encounter between Rommel's analytical intelligence and the operational record of Patton's decisions. an encounter in which Rommel, reading what Patton was doing in Sicily and projecting what Patton would do next, was not studying an alien tactical philosophy, but recognizing a familiar one. The encounter was, in the truest sense, the recognition of a professional peer. What Rommel knew about Patton, he knew from the intelligence reports of what Patton's forces were doing, and from the specific character of Patton's operational decisions that those reports described. The speed, the forward command presence, the willingness to accept tactical risk in exchange for operational momentum, the specific and consistent pattern of a commander who makes the same kind of decision in the same kind of situation, in ways that, once identified, allow a professional observer to project what the commander will do next, with a predictive accuracy that goes beyond pattern recognition into something closer to understanding. Rommel himself was not immune to this kind of projection. The intelligence services of both the British and the American command made specific and documented efforts to understand Rommel's operational decision patterns and to design their own operations accordingly. And the success of Alam Halfa in August 1942, where Montgomery's defensive position had been arranged specifically to receive the attack that Rommel's operational pattern predicted he would make, and whose defeat was produced as much by that anticipation as by the British defensive positions themselves, is evidence that the projection can work both ways. The specific recognition that Rommel extended to Patton is the recognition of a man who knows what pattern-based tactical projection requires, has had that projection applied to himself, and is applying it to his adversary with the professional respect of someone who understands what he is seeing. What he recognized in those descriptions was the same recognition that military professionals extend to each other across the centuries when they read the battle reports of opponents who solve tactical problems the way they themselves would solve them. The recognition of a mind that understands what the battle requires in the same fundamental way, that identifies the decisive point and moves to it with the same impatience, with the caution that conventional military calculation prescribes, and that produces in the soldiers it commands the specific combat effectiveness that comes from men who believe, because the evidence of their own experience confirms it, that their commander will be where the fighting is hardest, and will have already thought through what needs to happen next before they arrive. The German military's study of Patton, the intelligence assessments, the operational analyses, the specific incorporation of Patton's estimated intentions into German defensive planning from Tunisia through the deception of Fortitude, is the highest form of professional military compliment available to any commander. The acknowledgement, by the opponent whose judgment matters most, in the brutal mathematics of military competition, that this is the man whose moves we must understand before we can plan our own. It is the same compliment that military professionals have extended to each other across the centuries, when one commander's reputation has grown large enough that opposing commanders must account for it in their own planning, must build their defensive preparations not merely around the terrain and the force ratios and the operational conditions, but around the specific probability that the man on the other side will find the solution they have not fully closed, will move at the moment they have not fully prepared for, will arrive at the objective through the route they rated as impassable. Rommel had earned this kind of study from his opponents. He recognized, in Patton, a commander who was earning it from his. Rommel understood this. The German military understood this. And the war that they fought against Patton, in North Africa and Sicily, and in the fiction of Fortitude, was a war against a mind that had spent 30 years preparing to fight exactly this kind of war, against exactly this kind of opponent, and that had been ready for this moment since long before the moment arrived.